Welcome in, everybody, to Fantasy Pros. This is the Fantasy Football Podcast. It is me, Joey P, Joe Pisapia, and today we're going to tackle a very special subject. This is like the after-school special. Sometimes things can go right. Sometimes things can go, well, horribly, horribly wrong. And every single year, there's a handful of players that can either make your season or absolutely break you into 1,000 pieces and have you listening to Taylor Swift songs for the next 6 months of your life. So instead, we're going to try to identify those players, and maybe the guys here can convince me one way or the other if these players are more the heartbreak type or more the league winning type. And to help me do it, fresh off the links, is our own Pat Fitzmaurice, doing amazing betting pros content over at the golf every single week. Just absolutely crushing that. And fresh from the barber, as always. Things are always looking tight there for my dude, Andrew Erickson, the Undertaker himself. So the guys have made a list, each of 6 players that we're going to get to today. Before we do, just a quick reminder, the mock draft simulator is up and running. So if you're running your rookie league drafts, you are running your regular drafts here, just getting ready for best ball, whatever you want to get ready for. FantasyPros.com. Mock draft simulator is open for business, so go get in there, start running your mock drafts, get a sense of the board. And Erickson, I know you've done a ton of best ball. What's the craziest thing you've seen so far?
Drake London's like a first-round pick on DraftKings. So you're high on Drake London. You gonna take him in the first round?
I don't know. I'm very high.
Well,
first round seems
the price
expensive.
is gonna continue to go up and up and up. So we'll see.
It's interesting to think about. Drake London, certainly one of these guys that's flying up draft boards. Fitz, as you've done some early rankings, and I know I'm getting Black Book stuff together, everyone's kind of compiling their thoughts post-draft. What's the one big change on a guy that's really kind of stuck out to you? We're like, I've got to just move this guy way up because, frankly, it just warrants it.
Oh, my. Boy, I like Kamani Vidal so much, and that landing spot with the Chargers is just so glorious. And I think I'm probably a good 20 spots ahead of the market on him on like redraft ADP.
That's a player that we talked about with Brett Coleman. If you missed that show, go back and watch it on the YouTube channel or just listen wherever you get your podcast. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel, drop your comments below, ring the bell till it goes ding, and be a part of the Fantasy Pros experience. That's what I'm going to call it this year. It's a Fantasy Pros experience. All right, let's start with the players, and let's start with a guy in the state of Texas now, because Stefon Diggs is no longer Buffalo Bill. There was only one guy in the entire fantasy football community that was talking trash last year about Stefon Diggs, and I took my lumps first 6 weeks. But after that, things looked exactly like I said. Old man couldn't get it done anymore. Now here's a dangerous spot here. Stefon Diggs now goes to Houston. So are people going to rush and think he's the number one there and possibly make a bad decision doing that? How is Stefon Diggs going to either make or break somebody's season?
That's a good question, Joe, because I don't know which Stefon Diggs we're getting. Are we getting the guy who's put together 6 straight 1,000-yard seasons and who has had more than 100 receptions all 4 of his seasons in Buffalo? I mean, his numbers in Buffalo averaged 111 catches, 1,343 receiving yards, and 9.3 touchdowns. Like, that is a pretty glorious run. But now he has got this extra target competition. And as you said, Joe, his productivity cratered last year over the second half of the season from week 10 through the end of the season. And we'll even throw in the Bills' 2 playoff games. Diggs averaged 42.2 receiving yards per game, 5.3 yards per target, which is just an absolutely wretched number, and had 1 touchdown over that 10-game stretch. So this could go one of 2 ways. Right now, Diggs' ADP is wide receiver 16, 27 overall, so he's an early third-round pick. I suspect that the ADP is going to go downward a little bit as people recognize this target situation with Nico Collins, who a lot of people like, Tank Dell, who a lot of people like. But maybe like Collins and Dell slide back into supporting roles, and Diggs does become the Texans' alpha receiver, just as he was in Buffalo, and he like pays off on that 4th round or 3rd round ADP. On the other hand, maybe the slide continues now that he's 30 and this target competition just kind of squashes his productivity.
Yeah, it's kind of dangerous to me. Nico's ECR right now of 18 on Fantasy Pros. Stefon Diggs is at 21. To me, they're not close. I think Nico is the true number one. Erickson, when you look at the Texans wide receiver core right now, and we didn't even talk about Tank Dell, do you see Stefon Diggs as anything more than maybe a glorified 2? And are people going to get maybe themselves in trouble by drafting him this year?
I think so. I think it's a lot of the name brand with Stefon Diggs, and I think that maybe he's productive to start the year, but ultimately when Tank Dell gets back to 100%, he was putting up numbers that looked like Nico Collins was last year. Like their target share were basically even. And when I look for Nico Collins, I'm less concerned about him from a target perspective because he wasn't necessarily winning last year because he saw like 15 targets because he was absurdly efficient. So when you're dropping in Stefon Diggs, yes, does that mean he sees 1 to 2 or fewer looks every game? Sure. But that also means every look that he gets is going to be one-on-one, where he's going to be able to create chunk plays, which is why we wanted him and why he was good last year. It wasn't because he was being used underneath and like guarding all these catches. It was because, oh, what do you know? Another 70-yard touchdown from Nico Collins. Like adding Stefon Diggs to me doesn't impact Nico Collins like in the way that he wins, and that's with efficiency. So I feel best about Nico Collins as the Texans wide receiver 1.
Now, the first guy on your list, we might as well stay with the Texans because it's CJ Stroud. Now, last year, we were very bullish on him. It worked out in Superflex leagues. It worked out in leagues, period. But this year, it's a much different cost. So Stroud does seem like a guy that could make or break your fantasy teams. What's your take this year on Stroud, Andrew?
Yeah, it comes back to real life versus fantasy. And last year, CJ Stroud was free, and he put up under 20 fantasy points per game. And that's kind of my hesitance with him, where he doesn't add a lot of rushing. Like, we can't forget the framework and the foundation of fantasy football quarterbacks is rushing. And CJ Stroud, at least last year, did not show that. Like, he was not a rushing quarterback really at the college level. And yes, he can move around like in the pocket, but he's not someone that's going to rush for a ton of yardage like a Lamar Jackson, like a Jaden Daniels. So that's a concern for him. And he didn't, again, as great as he was last year, led the NFL in touchdown to interception ratio. He was still under 20 fantasy points per game. Like, you can find that in a lot of different quarterbacks, getting to that 19-point threshold. Like, Patrick Mahomes last year was at 18.5 points, and he was bad last year. Like, that's the other thing, too, like the selling point with CJ Stroud and the fact that you have to draft him as a top 5 fantasy quarterback. He doesn't add a lot of value with his legs. We're chasing his absurd efficiency from the year previous. And that tends to not work out sticky. It's not a sticky stat year over year. So you're chasing all this efficiency with CJ Stroud after a rookie year. You're looking at Patrick Mahomes, best quarterback in the NFL, in my opinion. He was a fantasy bust last year. Like, those two things are not mutually exclusive. Like, you can be a really good real-life quarterback. The Texans can have a lot of success, but that doesn't mean CJ Stroud's going to be a good fantasy quarterback if you draft him in the top 5. So, for me, why would I draft CJ Stroud when I could draft Joe Burrow 3 rounds later? Like, I could get Brock Purdy in round 12. Like, if you just look at like projections, for example, like Stroud is behind guys like Prescott, like Burrow, right next to Purdy. And those guys are all way cheaper than CJ Stroud. So quarterback to me is so much more about the price. And for that reason, like, I'm just probably not going to have a lot of CJ Stroud. But I also know at the end of the day, like, he is also that guy. Like, So if he is Peyton Manning, then he can bury me. And you also have to look at the Texans have improved from last year. Like, their offensive line is not going to be as hurt as much. Again, adding Stefon Diggs, whether you're looking at Diggs alone, like, that's an upgrade for Stroud. So again, I say all these things as like, oh, I can fade Stroud. I also know that if he is really this guy that is super elite, then he can bury me, which is why it's a make or break kind of scenario.
And what's so interesting, the guy that Fitzy brought up first, right, is a guy who people could say, oh, now he's got Stefon Diggs. I remember Stefon Diggs the last few years in Buffalo being unbelievable. Now he's got another amazing weapon. Well, maybe he's not so amazing anymore. And maybe it's going to inflate the cost of CJ Stroud some more. Fitzy, let's go back to you. Let's get another one of your guys, because this is another big alpha wide receiver, new to the league, Marvin Harrison Jr., who everybody's very excited about. Everyone's already ranked him basically as a wide receiver 1, but he could be a make or break kind of guy. How could things maybe go wrong for Marvin Harrison, and how could they go very right?
Well, I think where something could go wrong for him, Joe, is that he is already priced like pretty high for a rookie receiver. We're not used to seeing rookie receivers have this sort of ADP. Marvin Harrison's ADP right now, per FantasyPros consensus ADP data, is wide receiver 11, 18 overall. So he's going in the middle of the second round routinely. I was just in a best ball draft the other day where he went 202. So 14th overall. Like, that is a steep price, considering that I believe the rookie year ADP for Jamar Chase was like wide receiver 24. For CeeDee Lamb, it was like wide receiver 38. For Justin Jefferson, I think it was in the 30s. We're used to getting these discounts even on the first round wide receivers. No such discount at all for Marvin Harrison. Like, I love the guy, so I don't really have a big problem with that ADP. But what if Harrison is merely good in year one instead of great? Like, what if he puts up the sort of rookie year numbers that CeeDee Lamb put up? And like this year, some people have CeeDee Lamb as their wide receiver one. As a rookie, 74 catches, 935 yards, 5 touchdowns. Like, that was really good, but that was good for Lamb when he was wide receiver 38 as a rookie. If you're paying a wide receiver 11 price and getting under 1,000 yards, you're not going to be satisfied with that return on investment. So that's where things could go wrong. You basically need Marvin Harrison to smash right away at the price we're paying for him.
Right. You need that 11, almost 1,200 yards. You need the 100 catches almost. You need to be in that range for all that stuff to really work. Erickson, let's go to another one of your guys on this list of make or breaks. Again, we're talking about guys who could really take you over the top or really bury you deep beneath the earth. And Deebo Samuel seems like one of those guys, Erickson. This is a guy also who may not be a 49er by the time we get to the season too. There's a situation there where if they trade him a certain time, certain cap things kind of kick in. Plus, they could use that money to then re-sign to an extension, Brandon Ayuk. So, Deebo Samuel, his value in 2024, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's like every year with Deebo, right? It's like, which Deebo are we going to get? We're going to get the guy that stays healthy and scores a bunch of rushing touchdowns, or the guy that doesn't, and that doesn't stay healthy and he gets banged up. Like last year, we got the good Deebo Samuel.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like every other year, it's been good, bad, good, bad. So that's why he is an ultimate make or break player, because the upside case is what we saw last year. Wide receiver 12 in just 15 games played. He had 12 touchdowns. He was scoring rushing touchdowns, receiving touchdowns. He had the most red zone touches among wide receivers. So, but when I'm looking at that though, that's my concern is like, how is this going to maintain? Like Brandon Ayuk is on a rocket ship to the moon. Like Brandon Ayuk can only be contained for so long before he finally takes over this 49ers offense. So again, I liked Ayuk more than Deebo last year. They were both productive, but ultimately Samuel just like narrowly beat him out. But that comes down to the touchdowns, right? And that's something that tends to not carry over. Again, looking at what's sticky year over year, touchdowns tend to not be sticky year over year. It fluctuates just based on where you happen to get the ball on the field. So for me, Deebo, again, scored the most fantasy points over expectation. Like that's just telling you right there, hey, we're going to see some regression from this guy that has shown in the past that this happens to him. Like it was like 2 years ago when it was like he was putting up absurd rushing numbers, like not even on the ground from touchdowns, but yardage. So based on his skill set, based on the fact that he has been banged up in past years because of how physical he plays, based on the fact that he may not even be on the 49ers, if he goes to a brand new team, how is this team going to use him? Like, use him the right way? Do we really want him to be on the Jets? Like with Garrett Wilson, with Robert Saleh, with Nathaniel Hackett? Like, no, I don't want that to happen. So there are just a lot of question marks with him where I kind of am leaning towards, I'd rather have Brandon Ayuk. I've ranked Ayuk over him, and they're ranked pretty closely in ECR and in ADP. So I like Brandon Ayuk personally as just the upside play, where Deebo, I think, carries a little bit more risk. But again, if he stays healthy, stays on the 49ers, you're going to look up big. Oh, what do you know? Deebo Samuel, another top 15 wide receiver season.
Fitzy, the Atlanta Falcons are a team that have a lot of expectations bringing in Kirk Cousins. And the Kirk Cousins effect now on some of these pieces who we loved the prospects when they came in. We love Drake London. We love Kyle Pitts. We love these guys because they had off-the-chart talent. But unfortunately, they came into a situation where the quarterback play was, let's just put it mildly, subpar. Now the expectations are much higher. Kyle Pitts, in particular, right now, tight end 7 off the board. So this is a tenuous situation because we've seen the flashes, but for the most part, it's been more disappointing than not. So Kyle Pitts in 2024, what's your take? Is he going to make or break fantasy leagues?
Oh boy, Joe. And the Kyle Pitts thing, like getting back on this bandwagon, like there are some of our followers who are just not having anything to do with it. I mean, as a pro wrestling aficionado, Joe, you know there are all sorts of ways for a heel, a bad guy, to generate heat. You can give your opponent a low blow or intimidate the referee or flip off the crowd. For a fantasy analyst to generate heat, all you have to do is say you're in on Kyle Pitts, and you're going to have people in your mentions like ripping on you. Like, oh, not this again.
Well, I'm wearing my
idiot.
CM Punk shirt today, so now you could say, tell me what I'm telling lies, baby. But you're right. I mean, that he's become a divisive guy because I think people have road rash from, the first couple of years of being so in and putting themselves out on a limb. And then unfortunately that limb breaking and people falling to their deaths.
Exactly. And that's the thing. I mean, Kyle Pitts really was a phenomenal tight end prospect, and he really did become the first rookie tight end to have 1,000-yard season since Mike Ditka 60 years earlier. And I think there's a plausible threefold explanation for why Kyle Pitts has been such a disappointment in the last 2 years. Number one, Arthur Smith is a chaos agent who ruins the fantasy value of everyone around him, unless your name is Derrick Henry or Tyler Algier. Number two, Pitts hasn't been fully healthy, like tore his MCL roughly midway through the 2022 season. Then we found out he also damaged his PCL, which wasn't thoroughly reported at the time. So not only did it end his 2022 season prematurely, it might have lingered into 2023. And number three, the quarterbacking has been upgraded, as you mentioned, with Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix. Some could say over upgraded. But anyway, now Smith is gone. Pitts should be healthy this year, and we've got this quarterback upgrade. So this is absolutely going to be a bellwether season for Kyle Pitts. And yes, as of now, I am in fact back in. So, be sure to hit me up with all your mean tweets telling me what an idiot I am for falling for the banana in the tailpipe again.
There you go. Erickson, Drake London, another piece of this offense that people are very excited about. But certainly there is some downside potentially here, depending on how these targets end up, depending on what it all looks like at the end of the day. Now, I've been somebody who's been kind of pedal to the metal here when it comes to Drake London in 2024, but you're seeing things already in the market where it's making you a little uncomfortable. Why?
Just because from like a drafting approach, just like systematically looking at, okay, we have a wide receiver here that has never posted the top 30 season his first 2 years in the NFL. Like, I get that he's posted high target shares. He hasn't really been competing for a lot of targets with really main competition. I mean, we just mentioned Kyle Pitts has been there. He hasn't been healthy. Like, that's been his main competition for targets. So yeah, Drake London's going to get a lot of targets when he's not competing really with anyone else. There's more competition in this offense than there has been in past years. Darnell Mooney is a good receiver. You have Kyle Pitts coming back. Bijan Robinson, like, going to be super involved in the passing game. So those are my concerns there, just like looking at the offense. But again, like I mentioned before, from a systematic approach, chasing the steam of the receiver that is the projected breakout, that every article you read is Drake London's going to break out this year. And I get that. Like, it makes sense. Kirk Cousins is there. But who was this guy last year? Oh, it's Chris Olave. Oh, he got Derek Carr. It's an upgrade. Didn't deliver. Oh, the year before that was Michael Pittman. Oh, he got Matt Ryan. Didn't deliver. And it's because they're not necessarily bad players. It's because their price is out of control. Like, and I mentioned at the beginning of the show, like DraftKings ADP best ball, Drake London went 13th overall, right in the first round. And I just look at that and I'm like, I get like to be excited for him, but like you have to take a step back. It's not hard to identify breakout wide receivers, but you have to practice discipline when it comes to, well, how high are you actually going to draft this guy? Because, 2 years ago, I was like, I just want Cortland Sutton. I don't care. Like, he's going to break out. And that he was a bust. When you just look at historically the receivers that bust, they all fall in the breakout category. Oh, he's going to break out and he gets really expensive and that's why they're a bust. So Drake London could have like
they refresh at quarterback too.
Exactly. So you're just layering in more question marks. It's like, yes, Kirk Cousins should be an upgrade, right? Yeah, there are plenty of situations.
I'll go as far he is an upgrade. Let's just say he is an upgrade.
Okay, well, we have not seen him throw a football coming off a torn Achilles. I'm just going to say that. In a brand new offense with an offensive coordinator that has never called plays. Like, there's just so much that you're banking on. It's like, why not just draft George Pickens in like round 6? Like, he's got a lot of upside too. Like, yeah, there's question marks with him, but like the risk where you're taking guys so much later on that could also break out versus you're drafting Drake London like he already has broken out. Like, we've already seen him be with Kirk Cousins and be good. Like, if he's good with Kirk Cousins, isn't he just going to be drafted in the same spot next year? Like, isn't that what we're kind of looking up and seeing? So for me, it's like, yeah, I like Drake London, but I'm going to bet against him if he's going to be this highly priced, just based on historically receivers that are the most, like the highest projected breakout receivers in the drafts, they usually don't return on the investment.
The Falcons certainly would be a team from fantasy perspective we're going to be debating all summer long on Fantasy Pros. I can tell you that right now. It's going to be fun too. Speaking of George Pickens, who you just mentioned, Fitzy, that's the next guy on your list. So the Pittsburgh Steelers, now this is their guy. Ironically, they also have a new quarterback, which kind of fits into exactly what Erickson was talking about. A guy who maybe he's an alpha dog, but he has a new quarterback, so everybody has this renewed sense of breakout potential. So he says he might rather look at Pickens maybe over Drake London because of the price you have to pay for those two guys. But what's the upside and the downside to George Pickens this year?
Well, the downside is that there's another guy we were just talking about, Arthur Smith. And here he is rearing his head in Pittsburgh to possibly cause consternation for fantasy enthusiasts in a different town. So, yeah, I mean, like, the upside is that Pickens is clearly the number one wide receiver in Pittsburgh right now, and that the Steelers really upgraded the quarterback position with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. So they've got two outs here in case they need it, in case Russ really is cooked and not actually cooking. They can turn to Justin Fields, who's had some success in the past. So with Deontay Johnson getting traded to Carolina, this really opens things up for Pickens. And we should remember that when Deontay Johnson injured his hamstring in week 1 of last year, Pickens had 17 catches for 357 yards and 2 touchdowns in the 4 games that Deontay spent on IR. But hello, Arthur Smith. Last year in Atlanta, we were just talking about Drake London, and everything looked great. And I was very much in on Drake London and drafted him all over the place last year. Drake London was 24th in wide receiver targets in Arthur Smith's offense, even though number 2 was Mac Hollins. And we had guys like Scotty Miller running around on the field and Kaderil Hodge. And so, like, Pickens is a guy who's kind of had trouble earning targets anyway. Like, he has not commanded a healthy target share, except in those instances when Deontay Johnson wasn't around. Even then, not huge target numbers for Pickens, but at least satisfying. So I could see a scenario where Pickens smashes in 2024, and I could certainly see a scenario where he disappoints.
I see Christian Kirk, Terry McLaurin kind of in that same range, and I think both of those guys might be a little bit safer, especially in full point PPRs. I think I'd rather pivot that way. Erickson, let's go back to you. Let's talk about a running back here. Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles now. Look, he's got a chip on his shoulder. He's got something to prove. He's got the division rivalry thing all cooking up there, so there's a lot of media, press, and let's be honest, he's playing in front of an offensive line there that's a huge upgrade, probably than anything he's ever played, even with Kelsey retiring. So, that being said, what's the downside besides injury to Saquon Barkley?
That Jalen Hurts gets all the touchdowns again, and that he's not used in the passing game. So, like, when he's been on the Giants, he's always been the best offensive player on the team. So he's always had to be forced the ball, whether it was as a rusher or as a receiver. So they're always trying to get Saquon Barkley the ball at all times. Not necessarily the case in Philadelphia, where there are many more playmakers. So it's really trying to find that balance of, okay, well, Saquon's probably going to average the best yards per carry of his career because he's going to be running behind lanes he's only dreamt about while being in New York, in behind this Philadelphia offensive line, especially with a mobile quarterback. But the downside is, okay, well, what if it's just Jalen Hurts just scoring all the rushing touchdowns again? That's what nuked DeAndre Swift and his fantasy appeal. But then 2 years ago, it was Miles Sanders who couldn't score touchdowns until he scored 11 touchdowns. So it's very tough to tell. It's we're going to know week 1. It's they line up to do the tush push and what's going to happen? What are they going to do? Is Saquon now another layer of that play where he's now under center maybe, and he's the one that's taking all the handoffs and they're going away from Hurts? So for me, I think I'd rather buy into Howie Roseman. Historically, he's never paid a running back, and he's seen Saquon Barkley twice every single year play against his Eagles, and he decided, I'm going to pay this running back. I have never paid a running back in free agency. I'm going to pay this running back. So I'm going to trust Howie here. I mean, if you've done that historically, you're probably going to come out in the green. So I'm going to do that here. I think they have a good plan for Saquon Barkley. There's no competition, at least in my eyes, that's already on that roster. Kenneth Gainwell, Will Shipley. I'm not afraid of those guys. I think those guys are just backups. So Saquon Barkley, he could just totally smash in the best supporting cast he's ever had in his NFL career.
Fitzy, let's stick with the running back position because you've got one over in Jacksonville and Travis Etienne that you think could be one of these make or break kind of guys in 24.
Yeah, we opened the show, Joe, talking about Stefon Diggs and the kind of Jekyll and Hyde season he had last year. Travis Etienne had the same sort of season, but I don't think people talk about it as much. Through the first 8 weeks of 2023, Travis Etienne was averaging 20.5 PPR points per game and was the running back 2 behind only Christian McCaffrey during that stretch. And then the Panthers gone by in week 9. From week 10 on, Travis Etienne averaged 13.2 PPR points per week. He was RB15 in total fantasy points over that stretch and RB21 in fantasy points per game. And like, he only had one game with more than 57 rushing yards after the Jaguars bye. He never had a game with more than 37 receiving yards. Like, it was just ugly. And I had him on one of my teams in redraft last year. Got off to a great start. I was like 7-1 and my team totally collapsed down the stretch. Limped into the playoffs, instantly got eliminated. And a big part of it was that Travis Etienne was just not producing for that team over the second half. So I don't know. Is he a true RB1 or is he an RB2 masquerading as an RB1? And I'm trying to stay positive because he's, like his first 2 years in the league, he's top 1,400 yards from scrimmage. And he averaged 19.1 touches a game last season. And the Jaguars really haven't added anyone of significance in their backfield. Keelan Robinson, who's, more of a kick returner type, was a day 3 draft pick. So yeah, the Jags offensive line was kind of a train wreck last year, but like, I'm optimistic that's not going to hinder Etienne too much. I just don't know. Like, I think he looks like a guy you could possibly take as an anchor running back if you're going with like a hero RB roster build. But man, if I'm leaning on him to be my RB1, I'm going to be a little nervous about it.
All right, let's take a look at another running back here. Andrew Erickson, Kyren Williams, who was a league winner last year. Let's just call it what it is. I think we all recognize the downside, which is maybe the carries get spread around a little bit more. That could be how he breaks your fantasy team. Matthew Stafford stays really healthy all year and is feeling good and is throwing the ball 40 times a game. Maybe that's it. But how can he make your fantasy league this year? Like, how can we get a repeat, in your opinion, of the Kyren Williams of 2023 and 2024?
Well, for starters, the Rams' offensive line is still really good. They had the potential to lose some guys in free agency, but they retooled. They made sure they signed the right players. They drafted guys, and that offensive line still looks really nasty, especially from a run blocking standpoint. So I'm not concerned about that. Obviously, drafting Blake Corum kind of raises the eyebrows of like, oh no, like, does this mean that we're going to see less from Kyren? And I guess like the question is, okay, well, this probably means he's probably not going to get like the 80-90% snap share, but if he's playing that many snaps, like that increases his likelihood to get injured, which is what we saw last year in his rookie year. He has been hurt both years. So if it's now like a 70-30 split, okay, does that mean he then plays more games? And does this mean his efficiency is better? Because he is getting a breather and he's not necessarily as tired when he's getting the ball every single time. So there are scenarios where I'm looking at Kyren Williams because it's like, okay, I can't like view him as like a top 5 guy, but the market has reacted to the Corum selection and he's not being drafted as a top 5 guy, even though that's all he did last year was basically put up top 5 fantasy football numbers. And what happens if week 1 comes around and, Corum's not up to snuff and they're like, oh yeah, 80% snap share for Kyren Williams, like after week 1. And we're like, oh no, like Sean McVay's just running it back again. So, I mean, I'm not concerned about him being the RB1. Like, he's going to be the RB1 in this offense. And it's just a matter of what is Corum going to do and what does the market think Corum is going to do. So I think you need to be open to the idea of, at a certain price tag, Kyren Williams is still really attractive because even with Blake Corum still there in a 70-30, like, that's still really good. Like, there's not a lot of there's only like 10 running backs that had a 70% snap share last year. And if Kyren Williams is one of them, and he's going now as like a low-end RB1, we've already seen the upside, especially if the Rams decide they just don't like Blake Corum and they're just like, we like Kyren Williams even more, then he's going to smash again. So again, I can't totally write him off because this guy could absolutely bury me because we saw what he was able to do last year.
Interesting too, if he gives up that 30%, it also might keep him on the field more throughout the season. So that's something you're willing to give up on a game-by-game basis to have him for more games over a season. Ironically enough, too, gentlemen, and I use that term loosely with the two of you, but Saquon Barkley, ECR of 6, Kyren Williams 7, Travis Etienne 8, all pre-mades in a row. At number 9, old man Derrick Henry. I think I know what Baltimore wants to do. Maybe I'll just bypass all of this question mark, make or break stuff and just go with the old Harbaugh, let's ground and pound with Derrick Henry. Maybe that's a way to pivot off of that. All right, we've each got one name left here between the boys, so let's start with you, Fitzy, because this one... I'm just leading the charge here, but I understand there's still going to be some peaks and values for Anthony Richardson in 2024. So let's talk about it. Let's get your perspective on a guy in Anthony Richardson, who could absolutely make your season, but could also break it too.
Yeah, I mean, we saw the upside with Anthony Richardson last year, albeit over a very short period of time, a very small sample size. He started and finished 2 games last year. In those 2 games, he scored 21.9 and 29.6 fantasy points. Good for weekly fantasy finishes of QB4 and QB2 those 2 weeks. So Josh Allen led all quarterbacks in fantasy scoring last year, and Anthony Richardson averaged 19.4% more fantasy points per snap than Josh Allen. So small sample size, but it is still pretty exciting to think about what this guy could possibly do over a full season if he can stay healthy. And oh, by the way, he never played with Jonathan Taylor last year. And just think about what Jonathan Taylor's presence as a running threat could do to Richardson's efficiency as both a passer and a runner. So that's really exciting. The thing is, Richardson has to demonstrate that he can stay healthy over a full season. And we don't really have much data on what sort of passer Richardson is going to be at the NFL level because, you know, he barely played. I love that he's paired with Colts head coach Shane Steichen, who was essential to the development of Jalen Hurts in Philadelphia. But still, it is a leap of faith right now to draft Richardson, considering that his ADP is QB7.
Yeah, I understand. But man, I look at him in single quarterback leagues and I say to myself, well, if I'm aggressive and I'm right, might win me that league. And if I'm wrong, there's enough value there in the depth of quarterback with the Kirk Cousins, Jared Goffs of the world, where I can have one of those guys too in the back end of my bench and just replace Richardson if injury or performance is poor, if some situation pulls up. So in single quarterback leagues, I feel like I'm willing to take that risk with Richardson. Superflex, that becomes a spot where I think it could break you, because if he does struggle as a passer or things start to go wrong, it's going to have to rely really heavily on the legs and maybe they become predictable. But I'm with you, man. Steichen is a guy that I believe in a lot. I'm very excited about the Colts and Anthony Richardson. So I think he is a make, not a break, but that's what we're talking about. And speaking of make or break, I don't know if there's one guy that looked more make or break last year than Achane of the Miami Dolphins. And I got to tell you here, Erickson, it was stunning. It was spectacular. It was fun to watch. It was like watching, you know, Icarus fly close to the sun and then at certain times just like burn up. So what's your take on this player going forward in 2024? Is he going to make or break us in fantasy?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew, because every time I see him on the clock, I don't know what to do. I'm like, because I think about his second game, he rushes for 200 yards in his second NFL game where he's actually playing. And then he went for over 100 in his next 2 games, and then he got hurt. And then we didn't see him for like weeks on weeks. So with Achane, it's the price is concerning to me because he's a second round pick. And usually a player of his archetype where he's super efficient, but is somewhat in a committee and has dealt with injuries and is undersized. Like usually you don't have to, second round pick. Like, right. That sounds about right. Like usually those guys are much cheaper, but because of the way that he just, as a rookie, just like immediately produced, like that sticks in fantasy managers' minds of how explosive this guy can be and how the FOMO, right? If you don't just draft Achane, like this, again, thinking about guys that can absolutely bury you, this is one of those guys where you're afraid, if I don't draft this guy, like he's going to absolutely kill me because of how explosive he is on the field. And I mean, I've wavered on Achane. Like one day I'm like, all right, I think I'm in. And then I think about like the value of like all these other running backs that you can get so much later than an Achane, that I feel so much more confident about what their role is going to be, what their workload is going to look like. Should we really be expecting like Achane to like average 10 yards per carry again? Like that's something that you should not be projecting. Like that's something that does not happen year over year. But we know he's going to probably still be above average when it comes to efficiency. I'm not afraid of Raheem Mostert. Like I know that for sure. I feel confident in that. Like 32 years old, there's a 10-year gap between Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane. Like that's comical to me. And Mostert stayed healthy for the first time ever in his career last year. Like, so if I'm going to be strongly fading Mostert as a real impact player on this offense, that I feel like I naturally have to be in on Achane, even though I don't like the price, because I know what the upside is with him, but I also recognize like it's just kind of like that's the price to pay. You got to get him in the second round, even if the value probably isn't there, because I don't think it is. It's a matter of getting your guy, and this is the price that the market has put with this guy that's super explosive. And again, like I said, I'm not afraid of Raheem Mostert.
I love that the ECR has him as 13. So it's like, yeah, he really could be an RB1, but he could also be an RB2. So let's just have him at 13. That feels right. He's going in a sandwich, by the way, between Rachaad White and Joe Mixon. So Joe Mixon, older running back, now with a fresh start in Houston. Rachaad White, maybe it's boring, but it's consistent. And then there's Achane, who is the sexy one in between, who could be this superstar who just completely breaks the running back position in that offense with all that speed. But the injuries and the size, so many question marks there. So these are the guys that could make or break fantasy. A lot of it has to do with what you're willing to pay for them. I think the guys will agree with that. And of course, we love to hear from you. Who are the players that you think are going to make or break you in 2024? And maybe the ones you just got to have regardless. Drop your comments below in the chat here on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to the FantasyPros channel as well. Of course, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Also, make sure on the YouTube channel you ring that bell for notifications, because we've got all the podcasts, the mock drafts, the shorts, everything is happening here on the FantasyPros YouTube channel, and we want you to be a part of the FantasyPros YouTube experience. That'll do it for us, but the story of the game goes on. For Andrew Erickson and Pat Fitzmaurice, I'm Joey P. We'll see you next time, kids.